The Northern Cheyenne had been forcibly removed to the Darlington Indian Agency on the reservation in western Oklahoma that was shared by the Southern Cheyenne and Southern Arapaho, right there by Fort Reno. And it was hard going, as I discussed earlier. There was insufficient food, certainly not sufficient hunting, and the whole area was ravaged repeatedly by epidemics of disease, so that within within a year or so, a large number, maybe as many as half or more, of the Northern Cheyenne had died. So by September 1878, there were only between 300 and 350 of them left, and their chiefs, their leaders, decided this is enough. So on the night of September 9th, Dull Knife, alias Morning Star, Little Wolf, along with the chief's Wild Hog and Left Hand, called the people together and informed them, tomorrow we're leaving. And they did. They headed north on the long, arduous odyssey back to their homeland. It was virtually a repeat of what happened with Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce, although in some ways the opposite way, right? Because the Nez Perce had started at home and were trying to get somewhere else. Here, these folks are far from home and determined to get back there. So they headed north, and as soon as the army realized they were gone, soldiers were sent after them. About, I think, 238 soldiers, commanded by a lieutenant colonel whose name was William Lewis. I had to check my notes there for a second, because it's not an easy name to remember. It's kind of a common name, and he's not real famous because they killed him pretty quickly. Actually, the Cheyennes set an ambush for the soldiers who were chasing them, and opened fire on them and killed several, including the lieutenant colonel. Then they continued north, crossing north to south through Kansas. On their way, not only were they being chased by soldiers, but they encountered groups of cowboys that they exchanged shots with, and local posses were put together to chase them. And as they proceeded up through Kansas, there were a lot of little skirmishes and a lot of depredations on both sides. Really, there were several instances of elderly or injured Cheyenne who fell behind the main group, and white posses caught up to them and either shot them or, in some cases, beat them to death. The Cheyennes, on the other hand, as they were going through Kansas, they were coming across farms, many of them operated by newly arrived immigrants who had never seen an Indian before, and they were raiding those farms. 41 men and boys in Kansas were killed in these various raids. According to the Kansas State Senate, there were about 24 white women raped, although historians generally believe that number is inflated. That doesn't change the fact that, in fact, some were. By the time they got out of Kansas, they had soldiers, untold numbers, probably in the thousands, from all the surrounding forts, chasing them, as well as a large number of groups of civilians. The Cheyenne tried to keep to the most arduous paths to throw off their pursuers. Finally, as they traveled up through Nebraska, they took a pause to kind of evaluate and see where they were. There were now only about 150 of them left. Some of them wanted to stop fighting and surrender. Others wanted to keep going. So the decision was made that Little Wolf would keep going, and about 100 went with him, farther north into the Powder River country. The remaining 150 or so would go with Dull Knife, and this included the other chiefs, Wild Hog and Left Hand, would go with Dull Knife to surrender at the Red Cloud Agency there in the northeastern corner of Nebraska, hoping that they could get intercession from Red Cloud and Spotted Tail, because that's where they had been. However, Dull Knife and the other Cheyenne didn't know that now things had been switched around, and there was a reservation, the Pine Ridge Reservation, across the border up there in South Dakota is where they were. So they decided, instead of going to Pine Ridge, to go to the Red Cloud Agency. Well, they were already there, to surrender themselves at Fort Robinson, formerly Camp Robinson. And the request that they made was that they be allowed to live at the Pine Ridge Agency, the Pine Ridge Reservation, with the Sioux, their allies. However, bear in mind that Fort Robinson is where Crazy Horse had gone the previous year to negotiate, and remember how things turned out for him. Fort Robinson's not a good place to go, apparently, because not only were their requests denied, they were arrested. They were told to voluntarily turn around and go back to Oklahoma. They refused, so they were arrested. They were put in rooms with barred windows. What they didn't realize there, the soldiers at the fort, was that Dull Knife and the Cheyennes with him were not exactly that trusting of white people at this point. And so they had smuggled weapons in with them, including some of their best guns, which they had disassembled and hidden among the women's clothing, hidden parts of it in plain sight as little pieces of metal that they were all sort of like using as jewelry. And once they locked them in these rooms, they put their guns back together. On the night of January the 9th, 1879, they made their attempted escape from Fort Robinson. They were pursued by soldiers, and there was fighting in which maybe as many as 20 or 30 of the Cheyenne were killed, including Left Hand. About 65 were captured and brought back to Fort Robinson, 23 of whom were wounded. Within another day or two, they found a group of 6 young warriors who had kind of stuck together, who were hiding, and captured them. Then they came upon 32 people who had stayed in one group. It was made up of 18 men, well, men and teenage boys, and about okay, I messed up. And 14 women and children. They had prepared a defensive position in a dry creek bed. This is January in the North Country, so it was very snowy. About 150 soldiers attacked them, running up to the edge of the creek bed and firing in. When all was said and done, all 18 of the men and teenage boys were dead, as were 4 women and 2 children. There were 8 surviving women and children who were found buried underneath the dead bodies, and I assume taken back to Fort Robinson. Altogether, fewer than 10 Cheyenne managed to escape and avoid recapture. Some of them made it up to the Powder River country and joined Little Wolf. Dull Knife was one of those who did successfully escape, But he followed through with his original plan and went to the Pine Ridge Agency and surrendered there rather than at Fort Robinson. Eventually, Little Wolf, who made his way up to the Powder River country with his 100 followers, was contacted by officers from Fort Keogh. Worked out a whole lot better than the whole Fort Robinson thing, which came to be called, by the way, the Fort Robinson Massacre. Much friendlier terms between the officers at Fort Keogh, and Little Wolf agreed to come into the fort with his 100 or so followers. And not only were they not arrested, they were offered a job as scouts for the U.S. Army, which all of them accepted. Finally, 5 years later, in 1884, the Northern Cheyenne were given their own reservation in Montana, in their traditional homeland. And here it is on the map of Montana, right there, neighbors to the Crow Nation. At the Northern Cheyenne Reservation, tribal headquarters being in Lame Deer. There is you can find the Chief Dull Knife College. One other story that took place during this same time period that is similar in a lot of ways to the stories of the Nez Perce and the Cheyenne Exodus is the story of the Ponca chief Standing Bear. But before we get into that story, I need to talk about someone else a little bit. For reasons that will soon become apparent. And that is the Laflesche family, specifically the Laflesche siblings. Here we see 3 of the 5. There were 2 other daughters, but they were not in the public eye as much as these 3 were. They were the children of, believe it or not, a couple named Joseph and Mary. Joseph was the son of a French-Canadian trapper and a Ponca woman, and Mary was the daughter of an Omaha woman and a U.S. Army surgeon who had been assigned to Fort Atkinson in Nebraska, which was the first U.S. Army fort built west of the Mississippi, around 1817 or so, I think is when it was built, and it was in operation through the 1820s. So these kids grew up speaking English, probably French, and definitely both Ponca and Omaha. These 3 in particular went on to become very highly educated for Native Americans of that time, very highly educated for that time. Suzette went to school in New Jersey and got a degree and became a teacher on the Omaha Reservation in Nebraska. Later on, she became a journalist. In fact, when she was, I guess she would have been in her late 30s, she and her husband, Thomas Tribbles, moved to the Pine Ridge Indian Agency to cover the ghost dance movement that was going on there. So she was present for all of that. Francis got his law degree at George Washington University in 1892, got his master's the next year. In the years before that, he had been working, he and actually Suzette had both been working with an anthropologist named Alice Fletcher. And they had both gone with Alice Fletcher in the early 1880s to the Rosebud Reservation. Fletcher studied the Lakota Indians. Francis Laflesche became the first Native American anthropologist / ethnologist, and he worked for the Smithsonian Institute, and he wrote several books about his areas of expertise, the Omaha tribe and the Osage tribe. Finally, Susan, the youngest sibling, went to medical school in Pennsylvania and received her MD, becoming the first Native American MD, first Native American doctor. And then she went back to the Omaha Reservation and served as the doctor there for many, many years, not only on the reservation, but also the non-Indian folks in the nearby town. And she was very active in politics, speaking out about health and sanitation issues, as well as protesting allotment. In fact, all three of these were very, very vocal and very active for Native American rights in the late 19th, early 20th century. All of them, well, not all of them, Suzette and Frances are the ones we're going to talk about in context of Standing Bear, were in their 20s when the next part of the story took place. In 1878, the Ponca had been removed by the U.S. government from their Nebraska homeland and put, you guessed it, in Oklahoma. And you guessed it, in very bad conditions. So the same conditions that the Northern Cheyenne encountered when they were sent there, which is to say, difficult to find food and ravaged by epidemics of disease. And within a few months, quite a few of the Ponca had died of disease, including the oldest son, Bear Shield, of one of the Ponca leaders, Standing Bear. Now, Standing Bear had promised his son, when they were being removed, that if you die before I do, the son had made him promise that if he were to die first, that his father would make sure he was buried in their homeland, not in some strange land. So after his son died in the late spring, Standing Bear and about 30 others of his family and supporters took his son's body and left the reservation, headed north to Nebraska. And they did take him up there and bury him. And they stopped at the Omaha Reservation. Remember, that's where the Laflesche siblings were living. They stopped at the Omaha Reservation and were greeted as friends and relatives by the Omahas. However, when word got out that a bunch of Poncas, who were supposed to be in Oklahoma, were up there with the Omahas in Nebraska, General Crook was pretty upset about that because, they're supposed to be on the reservation. So he looked into it. He had them arrested for having left the reservation. After having them arrested, he heard their story. After he heard their story, he looked into conditions down in Oklahoma on the reservations down there and was very displeased with what he saw there, too. In fact, he was aghast at how bad the situation was. And so he actually delayed having the Poncas that he had placed under arrest, which was his duty to do. He delayed returning them. He gave them time to rest up, and he started talking with a friend of his. That friend was Thomas Tibbles, who was an assistant editor at the local Omaha newspaper. So General Crook told his friend the whole story, and Tibbles then started printing stories about it there in the paper that started to get attention locally and then nationally. This is a very sort of easily romanticized story about a man wanting to bury his son in his native soil. So before long, a couple of very prominent lawyers stepped forward, offering their services to Standing Bear pro bono. Now, Tibbles there, by the way, would continue to be very involved in this case, and this is where he met Suzette Laflesche, who was engaged to be the interpreter for Standing Bear during the trial. Suzette and Thomas Tibbles eventually, as I mentioned before, got married and wound up at Wounded Knee in the early 1890s. So the trial is held I mentioned a trial. I haven't told you about what the trial is for, right? So these lawyers stepped forward, and probably with the consent of General Crook, recommended Standing Bear should sue General Crook for false imprisonment, essentially. So the trial was held. It was covered heavily by the press, and the stories went around the country. At one point, Standing Bear was told that he could speak on his own behalf and through his interpreter, Suzette Laflesche. After having been sworn in, he said, holding out his hand, "That hand is not the color of yours, but if I prick it, the blood will flow, and I shall feel pain. The blood is of the same color as yours. God made me, and I am a man." Well, the charge was, the false imprisonment from the fact there was no habeas corpus, which means, you have to have a charge and you have to have evidence. You have to have a body, even though that applies beyond just murder. And there was none, right? It was just the U.S. government telling Indians what to do. The judge ruled in the U.S. District Court. The ruling came down in favor of Standing Bear. The court case was Standing Bear versus Crook. So the ruling came down in favor of Standing Bear. And the judge, in his ruling, said that there had been no appropriate basis on the part of the federal government to arrest these Poncas to begin with. And he said that within the meaning of habeas corpus, quote, "an Indian is a person," end quote. So essentially, this ruling said that American Indians are human beings with basic human rights, which may sound like a ridiculous thing to say, but that had never been said legally in the United States before. So this is a very important court case, very important. That would be the basis for a lot of rulings after that went in favor of Native Americans, because it established that they have human rights. Now, after the case was over and Standing Bear was freed, he was allowed, along with his followers, about 170 people, to permanently go back to their home territory in Nebraska. Now, this wasn't all the Poncas. It was the Poncas under the leadership of Standing Bear. So as a result, to this day, there are two federally recognized Ponca tribes. There's the Ponca tribe of Nebraska and the Ponca tribe of Oklahoma. After this, Standing Bear twice went on extensive speaking tours of the United States, and on the second time, going beyond that to Europe. And Suzette Laflesche and her brother Francis accompanied him on these speaking tours, taking turns being his translator. And he spoke before very receptive audiences all around the U.S. and Europe, talking about the bad conditions on reservations, talking about the the American Indians and their longing for freedom and recognition of their basic human rights. The Laflesche siblings, particularly Suzette, went on to write newspaper articles and editorials. She joined her future husband in a career as a journalist, writing extensively about Native American rights. So this was, well, for one thing, it's a happy ending for them. Not so happy for the other Poncas who got stuck still in Oklahoma, but at least for that band, wound up being a happy ending. So three different cases that have a lot of similarities, taking place around the same time, the late 1870s. So I didn't tell you what had happened with Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce after they surrendered. They had been told by General Miles and General Howard that if they surrendered, they would be returned to their home country, and then they would be living on that reservation in Idaho where they had originally been told they had to go. But General Sherman countermanded that and said, no, they're going to Oklahoma. Actually sent them to Kansas first for a few months, and then on to Oklahoma, where, just like with the others, the conditions were very, very difficult. So, three different native groups wind up in Oklahoma and want to go home. Now, there's another connection. There's another connection that I haven't really laid out yet, but I'm going to in just a second. First, I want to wrap something up. There were two very small Indian wars in Idaho in 1878 and 1879 in the jurisdiction of General Oliver O. Howard, who, by the way, had also been a very prominent Civil War general and whom Howard University is named after. Why am I mentioning these? Since this is actually west of our area of study here, the Northern Plains, and is in fact just south of the original territory of the Nez Perce. Well, it is very significant, these two small wars. And when I say small, the first one that happened, the Bannock War, which was between the U.S. and the Bannock and Paiute tribes. At most, there were 15 people killed on each side. The Sheep Eater War, which happened in 1879 and involved the Sheep Eater Band of Shoshone Indians, who had been accused of murdering some miners in the area, although it's by no means certain that that did in fact happen, led to one U.S. soldier being killed and a handful of Shoshones. So why is this even worth mentioning? I bet none of you have ever even heard of these two wars. It's worth mentioning because with these two wars, at their conclusion, the only Native American people left for the U.S. government to fight that have not been basically defeated and forced onto reservations are the Apaches along the Mexican border in Arizona and New Mexico. The last really big Apache war was the war with Victorio that started in August of 1879 and lasted for a little over a year. He wound up being killed by the Mexican army. Then there were a few raids by Nana the following year, and 1882, Geronimo went back to war with the United States. So for the majority of the 1880s, Geronimo's band was the only one that the U.S. Army was fighting. And it was never a very large band, and it was confined, again, to the desert Southwest, although that's no comfort if you were one of the people caught in the middle of it. Eventually, however, by 1886, Geronimo himself also surrendered along with his band. They were sent to prison in Florida for a couple of years, then relocated, guess where, to Oklahoma. It was General Crook to whom Geronimo surrendered. But the point is, after the end of the wars in the northern plains with the Lakota and the Cheyenne, then just those small, relatively minor things up in the mountains with the Paiutes and Shoshones. Aside from that, only the Apaches are the ones that the Army's having to worry about. This map shows unceded Indian land in dark brown over time. Remember what I've said several times, particularly during the first half of this course, that prejudice against Native Americans is largely dependent on proximity in space and time. Because, as we've talked about again since the very beginning of the course, there's always been this sort of paradoxical dichotomy in how white people have looked at Native people in the Americas, either demonizing them or romanticizing them. And the proximity in space and time. That means that whenever there have been Native people occupying the same space or nearby space with white people at the same time, and therefore competing for resources, that is when the Native people have been most demonized, when they have been treated the most badly. And it has been true, starting in the 1700s, that as soon as a Native group that had been competing with you is out of the picture by either being wiped out or being physically removed, or their numbers being depleted to the point that they are no longer anywhere near a threat, barely even registering, at that point, they begin to be romanticized. Remember, they were demonized in New England until they were all gone, or most of them. Then they started to be romanticized there. Same thing in the American South. Well, this is where we were by the late 19th century. After the, well, shit. All of America had been outraged over the death of Custer in the summer of 1876. But within a year and a half after that, with the defeat, the final defeat of the Lakota and the Northern Cheyenne, there were no more really large, independently operating tribal groups that would make people feel threatened. Instead, now there are the smaller groups, and they're being treated on a more individual level. So now it becomes possible to start romanticizing. And even some of the most prominent and even feared Native American leaders start to become celebrities, starting with Sitting Bull over on the far right there during his time with Buffalo Bill's Traveling Wild West show in the 1880s. In some ways, starting a little sooner than that with Standing Bear and that tour that he went on. There in the middle, you've got Quanah Parker, circa 1900. And to the far left, even Geronimo, the last to surrender. 19 years after his surrender, there he is driving a car, wearing a top hat. All three of them at various times were signing autographs for admiring fans who wanted to bask in the atmosphere, bask in the nimbus of the nobility of these, quote, lords of the plains. In fact, just to get a little clarity, let's look at the timeline of some of the events we've just discussed. Okay, so October 5th, 1877, Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce surrendered in Montana, whereupon they were sent to Oklahoma, where the Northern Cheyenne also had been sent. The Fort Robinson Massacre at the sort of the terminus of the Northern Cheyenne exodus, that happened in January 1879. Remember, the Cheyenne had divided into two groups, one led by Dull Knife, which was there for that massacre, and one by Little Wolf. Both of them wound up at Fort Keogh serving as scouts when all this was said and done, but still not allowed to return to their home territory. Then, in May of 1879, that court case in Omaha led to Standing Bear winning, being declared human, getting a lot of attention in the press, and his band, as a part of that decision, was allowed to go back, to leave Oklahoma and go back to their homeland in Nebraska. Immediately, Standing Bear and the Laflesches started on their lecture tour that lasted for 4 years until 1883, traveling all around the country and even to Europe. Well, the next year, the Nez Perce, who had been sent to Oklahoma, they're allowed to go back to their home territory in Idaho. Then the year after that, the Northern Cheyenne are granted a reservation by the federal government in their homeland of Montana. So ultimately, all three groups wound up either in their homeland or at least close to it. But a lot of that, I think, is connected to the fact that the threat, unless you lived in the Southwest along the Mexican border, the threat seemed to be over to white people from Native Americans. So now there was room for that age-old American tradition of romanticizing the, quote, vanishing red man, the, quote, noble savage. But that whole proximity thing is still a factor. And as we shall see, this romanticizing only goes so far.